Debugging epics. Debugging epics. Let's understand, what is debugging and why do we need to debug. Epics provides debugging support. So debugging basically is when you find a bug in the code. Bug in the code is basically when you have written the code, there is no syntax error, the code got saved, but when you try to execute it, you're not getting the result as expected. That's the bug. Okay, if there is a syntax error, the moment you try to save the code, at that time only it will throw you the error, right? You get the syntax error and you understand that there is an error and you rectify it. All right, but a bug is basically it got saved and it did not have any syntax error, but the moment you try to execute the code, you don't get the expected result. That's where there's a bug. Okay, and this bug can be due to several reasons. The reason can be the data which is being supplied to the code is not as per what do you call it? The data types which has been defined. You have defined a data type as string, and instead of string, you are supplying something else, right? Or you are supplying any subject. So there can be several reasons for the bug. So on the runtime, there can be some mismatch with the code, and that's the reason why the result might not be as per the expectation. That's a bug. Okay. Now, how do you find out a bug in Salesforce? Apex provides debugging support. So Apex gives you support for debugging the code. You can debug your Apex code using developer console and debug log. So there are two ways of finding the uh, bug in your Apex
Hello.
code. One is through developer console, one is through debug log. Hello.
Ji, Ravi.
Right. So you can debug your Apex using two approaches. One is your debug log, another is developer console. Right. Okay. So first of all, let's understand what is debug log. A debug log can record. What is debug log? It's basically a log of everything that is happening when you try to execute your Apex. A log of everything that is happening. Okay. So you have the system of tracking the debug log. This debug log can track your database operations. So when I say everything, what all are included in that everything? All the database operations, like any record is being inserted or updated or deleted. All your system processes, something like a workflow rule got executed, assignment rule got executed, approval process, validation rules. These things get tracked in the debug log. So database operations, the processes, and the errors in case there is an error. Okay. So a debug log is basically a log of all these things. Right. So if you find, say, you run an Apex code and you see that the result is not as per your expectation. You were expecting something else to happen, but that did not happen. You're trying to figure out the bug. So debug log is an option. If you get the debug log, which will have breakup of all the database operations which happened, uh, which will have detailed breakup of all the system processes that will happen, and it will have all the errors that occurred. Then your life will become easy, right? So you can figure out that, okay, fine, what all things happened, which all things did not happen, and you can exactly go to the point and understand that, okay, this is where the error was. Correct. So that's what a debug log is. Okay. You can also find the logs in the developer console. Okay. You can use the logs tab. Let me show it to you. One second. Rather than looking at this, let me log in into Salesforce and show it to you. Okay. So where do you find the debug logs? We talked about debug logs, but where would you find the debug logs? Debug logs is available here. Under setup, you go to logs. Here you will see debug logs. Okay, you'll have to start the debug log. By default, your logs are not getting tracked. Okay, but you have to go to a debug log and you'll have to start tracing the debug logs. Okay, so if you start it, a debug log starts recording database operation system processes and errors that occur when executing a transaction. Okay, that's what I was talking about. So you can initiate a debug log here, create a new debug log, and after that, once you have initiated the debug log tracing, then what will happen? See, you define a start date, expiry date. So all the apex operations, basically which happen between this period, they are traced as debug logs. Like one log is already here, right? So now what will happen? See, here it is, right? So it tracks all the details. Okay. Same thing can be done from your developer console also. So this is where the log will be traced, and you can also do the same debugging from developer console. Now in developer console you have the freedom of just writing a small piece of code, executing that, and you can debug that also. For example, if you just want to write a few lines of code, for example, okay, then you try to uh, execute this. Fine. You will see the logs available here also. This is the one. Open it under the logs. See, this is your execution log. You just want to see the debug logs. Okay. So you can see the debug log only. What is debug? What is this debug thing? There's a system defined method called system.debug. Give me one second. Take a scenario. Let's say there is okay, there's a requirement that you have written in Apex code. That Apex code should take the email ID of all the contacts which were created today and send them emails. Okay, so I have written an Apex code which should take all the contacts which were created today and it should send them an email. Okay, after running that code, you found that the emails were not sent or it was not sent to one contact. Okay, which means there is a bug. Code does not have a problem. I mean, syntax wise it does not have a problem, it's working fine. Today you saw that it's not working. Now there are a lot of things which are happening when you are executing the code, right? So your point A is, initially point A is where contacts are there in the database, and finally the email should have been sent, correct? This is what we are actually looking at. We are looking at moving from point A to point B. Okay. Now, if the code did not work here, there can be a lot of reasons. Something might have gone wrong in one of the steps in between. So, what's going to actually help you? The debug log. Okay. So, for example, now in this process also there are certain things. First is this process initiates. There is a query that happens, right? There must be a query which must be happening to pick all the records from the contact list. Then email is sent, notification sent to admin. Let's say these are 4 steps. Okay. Now, one of the things might be missing. You might have made mistake in one of, or something might be missing. Either the query is not fetching any email ID, or the email method is failing. Maybe because the email IDs which it is fetching are actually not email IDs. The format is not correct, or the notification is not being sent, right? So now you would want to figure out where exactly the problem is, right? So let's say for doing this, you have 100 lines of code. Okay, this is line 1, this is on line 25, this is on line 50, this is on line 75, and this is on line 100. Okay, now even if you get the debug log of the entire stuff, the point is that you will still have difficulty understanding that where the problem has been. Just getting the debug log, the entire story, what all happened in this 100 lines of code will not help you. Correct? So for that, what you do is we use a system.debug method. Okay. So this system.debug method will actually help you uh, to put those checkpoints in between this entire 100 line. Okay. So for example, this query is returning me a list of contacts called CON. Okay. There's a list of contacts. So after line number 20 or line number 50, you might want to do a system.debug contact, list of contacts, just to see whether there is some result being returned on that. If it is actually returning, if this system.debug returns a result, means your code is fine till here, then the problem must be here. Correct? So this is how you should be debugging your code, step by step, or checkpoints. That is something which you have to put in between. So if you feel that the error can be because of the value not supplied to the query, so let's see. If you see that this list of contacts, the query is fetching results, or it's actually getting the email IDs, then there has to be something wrong with either the email IDs or the email method that you have written. Then you start checking things here. Okay, then you can put another checkpoint here. So one system.debug can be here, one system.debug can be here, one can be here, right? So this will actually help you figure out where exactly in which part of the code the error is. If the query is not fetching data, means maybe today there were no contacts which were added, or maybe the contacts which were added do not meet the criteria which you have defined in the query. For example, if the created date has to be today, maybe somehow by system error or something the created date is not today, it is yesterday's date. So something must be wrong with the query or the data which is being supplied. Correct. So the same way you have, if the email is not being sent, either the email IDs are not correct, or the method that you have written is not correct, something like that. So this is how it works. This is how we do the system.debug. This is how we use the system.debug method to put the checkpoints in between. Right. So here in developer console, when you say debug only, it will only show you the system.debug methods. Okay, so wherever your checkpoints you have put. Okay, use the logs tab in the developer console, as we just saw that we can use the logs tab in the developer console also to check the debug logs. Okay, now debugging is one part. All right, just using the system.debug is one part. The second thing is, when you're debugging, you also want to catch what kind of exception has happened. Okay, I will not call it error. An error is something which will be, by default get caught in the syntax, while you're trying to save the program. We call it exception. Exception means your code is not working. It's working fine for some data. It's not working for some data, some other data. So why is it not working for this part of data? Because there can be certain exception. As I said, exception can be anything. The query is not fetching any data. The email ID which has been provided is incorrect. So any such thing can be an exception, right? So it's not enough to just run the system.debug method. My system.debug method, when I'm running, it should also help me get the type of exception. You should also get some hint on what kind of exception is happening, right? That's the next part that you are going to understand. Now, how do you handle the exceptions, or how do you catch the exceptions? Okay, your system.debug method is actually going to tell you whether the code got executed till that point correctly or not. But if it did not get executed properly, what was the type of exception? So now the next thing that we have to understand is handling the exceptions. So handling exception is pretty simple. Just give me a minute. Let's understand the exceptions in Apex first. Apex uses exceptions to note errors and other events. Alright. So in case there is an error for that specific set of record or any other event, Apex uses an exception for that. That disrupts the normal flow of code execution. So anything that is disrupting the normal flow of Apex code execution, that is an exception here. Okay. So to catch these exceptions, we have a method called try catch finally statements. Okay. So it's important for us to catch those exceptions. We are not just gonna work with the debug log or the system.debug method. We also have to catch the exception. Correct. So whatever is the exception that has happened, for that we have a try catch finally statement available, and using this we can actually catch those exceptions. So that, okay, try catch finally statement is basically a combination of three statements. Try, catch, finally. You know, if you go by the literal meaning, first of all it will try to execute the code. If it doesn't execute, if the code doesn't get executed properly, it will catch the exception for that, and finally it will do something, whatever you instruct. Got it? So that's it. So try, catch, finally. You ask the system to execute the code. If it cannot, it should catch the kind of exception what is actually interrupting the flow, and if it is interrupting the flow, then what needs to be done. So as simple as that, right? So instruct your system to do something. If it is not able to do it, ask it what is the problem. That's the catch. Finally is instructing that, okay, do something else. Got it? So very simple. The try statement identifies a block of code in which an exception can occur. So this is the code where the exception can occur. So you try to execute that. The catch statement identifies a block of code that can handle a particular type of exception. Okay. So your catch statement basically catches the type of exception. Okay. It identifies a block of code that can handle a particular type of exception. A single try statement can have zero or more associated catch statement. So along with a try statement, you can put more than one catch statement. Each catch statement must have a unique exception type. Your catch statement should definitely have an exception type. Once a particular exception type is caught in one block, one catch block, the remaining catch block, if any, aren't executed. So in a catch block, if you are trying to catch two things, or trying to execute two lines of code, once one exception has been caught, the remaining of the code will not get executed, right? Which is fair enough. There's no point, keep on executing the entire code once the exception has got caught. The finally statement identifies a block of code that is guaranteed to execute and allows you to clean up your code. Okay. Now finally statement will have the code which is guaranteed to execute. So it will execute no matter what happens in the try, what happens in the catch, whether exception is caught or not, whether try statement is successful or not. Finally statement definitely gets executed. Okay. And this is usually used for fixing up the code or fixing up the uh, changes that you have made with your try and catch. For example, you are trying to execute, let's say you're trying to execute a code. Okay. In that code, you say update all the accounts, and after that, update all the opportunities. So all the accounts got updated. Now, the moment you tried updating opportunity, there was an error. Okay, that got caught. Now, just to make sure that your data is in consistent state, you might want to uh, say reset the accounts to the previous status, whatever status it was in. So that is the finally thing. So your finally statement can execute any block of code just to make sure that whatever changes have been made here, if there are any changes which have been made here, you might want to reset them to the normal situation. Fine. So that's what the finally statement is. Okay. The finally statement identifies a block of code that is guaranteed to execute and allows you to clean up your code. Okay. So it's again optional. You don't have to put a finally statement always. Okay. So syntax is pretty simple. You try, write the code block, then catch, write the code block, then catch another exception, catch one exception, okay, catch another exception, and write the code block for second exception, and then you write the finally code block. As simple as that, right? Now, so syntax is like this. Let's say you have a list of opportunity. You are trying to update ops. Okay. So this is what you are trying. So if it is successful, if the opportunities get updated, then it's fine. You tried updating ops and it got updated. But if you have doubt that, okay, fine, things might be failing here, then you would try to catch the exception, what exception is happening. So try this code block and catch, because it is update, you feel that, okay, the error can be because of DML. So you say DML exception E, okay, catch your DML exception, and here you say system.debug E. Got it? It should be e.message. so that it will show you the message of that exception heap. Got it? So it will catch the DML exception and it will throw you the message for DML exception. That's how it's going to work. If it works absolutely fine, then nothing will happen. Then it doesn't go to the catch. Got it? Okay. So this catch statement while you're writing, try is pretty simple. Try is just your simple block of code. When you're writing the catch statement, you have to first of all write the exception type. This is exception type. Like this is DML exception. There's an exception type. You have to write the exception type here. Okay, for the catch statement. That what type of exception do you want to catch here? So there are different exception types. DML exception just being one. So if you see the syntax, proper syntax, this is what. Define an exception type and then give a variable name to the exception. Okay. So every catch block can handle a specific type of exception, and you have to specify what exception you want to catch there. So let's understand the exception types also. DML exception. The first is a DML exception, which we just saw. Any problem with a DML statement, such as an insert statement missing a required field on a record. So any particular problem with a DML exception, like if a DML is not happening, there has to be some problem with that, right? Some value is not matching. Instead of number, you have supplied string. Required field value is not there. Something like that, right? So those kind of exceptions will be caught in DML exception. So there the exception type has to be DML exception. List exception. Any problem with a list, such as attempting to access an index that is out of bounds. Okay, so let's say there is a list and you're trying to access 10th value of the list, but the list actually has just 3 values. Okay, so that's the list exception. Got it? So if you do not have values available in the list which you are trying to access, that's a list exception. Okay. Null pointer exception. Null pointer exception is any problem with dereferencing a null variable. So you're trying to reference a variable which is actually null, which does not have any value. You have not initiated or you have not supplied any value to the variable. That's a null pointer exception. Query exception. Query exception is any problem with SOQL queries, such as assigning a query that returns no records or more than one record to a singleton SObject variable. Remember, I was just talking about that example that if you just want to query all the records from contacts which were created today and then send an email, there because the data is being queried, so at the query level you will check the query exception. Got it? That if my query is returning value or not, that's where you will check for query exception. Okay. So any problem with your SOQL query, such as your SOQL query not returning any records. So further operation is not happening because SOQL query is not returning anything. Correct? That's a query exception. Or if your query is returning multiple values, whereas the variable that you are using is a singleton SObject variable. Means if you have used a single SObject variable and the query is returning multiple values, then that's going to be caught as a query exception. Okay. Then there can be an SObject exception. What is an SObject exception? SObject exception is any problem with SObject records, such as attempting to change a field in an update statement that can only be changed during insert. Any particular specific rule with that SObject, okay? Let's say you are updating a field which cannot be updated, which can just be edited at the time when it was created. Okay, after that it gets locked. That's your SObject exception. Okay, any record which is logged or something. Those will be caught as SObject exceptions. All right. Now, apart from this, if you are not sure, most of the times you will have an idea. For example, if you are trying to perform a DML statement and it's not happening through, then you will get an idea that okay, fine, it's going to be possibly the DML exception. If you are working with a list, you will have an idea that it's going to be a list exception. So the same way, okay, most of the times you will have a rough idea that which exception it can be. Okay, it's very it's good to specify the exception type. So if you see that there can be a DML exception, use the DML exception type. Then what happens? Your job becomes easier, right? So if you're using a DML exception type, your job becomes easier. It directly gives you the DML exception message, and from there you can understand what exactly the problem is. Reading in the debug log, when you read this message, you understand what is the problem, and you know that the exception type is a DML exception. In some cases, if you are not sure, or if you feel that there can be multiple exceptions on any type of exception on your code, then you can also write this catch exception E. Okay, so this is also something which you can write. You can write catch exception E. Now E will be caught as an exception, and this exception can be of any type. Okay, and then you can say system.debug E dot exception type, and then you can say system.debug E dot message. Got it? Because it's a generic type, so you might want to check what is it. You might want to check what is the exception type here. Got it? So this is how your debugging thing will work. Got it? So that's it. You just have to, first of all, you have to see that if there is an exception which is happening on the code. Again, we are talking about exception. We are not talking about errors. Syntax error is different from exception, right? If there is a syntax error, you will not be able to save the code. See, there are a lot of people who actually make a mistake here. They do not understand what exactly debugging and when debugging is required. Debugging is required when some exception is. Bug is when there is an exception which is happening. The code got saved. It should work fine. It is working fine. You tested it properly. Now the moment you're trying, executing it on some set of record, you find that it's not working. Okay, that's called a bug. Okay, to check the bug, you have to, first of all, you just have to figure out the specific points that, okay, fine. Uh, as I said, I just gave this example that, okay, fine. If you are just trying to fetch some data from a query from the database and then trying to send an email, the problem either might be at this query level. So you can do a try catch, do a try catch here and check if there is a query exception or not. Okay. And then you can see if your email is being sent or not. All right, so that sort of stuff. Got it?